Hi there, I'm Spencer Campbell of Gila RPGs. Today I thought I'd just do a quick recording on a topic that is near and dear to my heart in role-playing games and games in general, which is asymmetry. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about asymmetry in tabletop role-playing games. Before we get started, though, I want to sort of clarify two things. First of all, I'm clearly presenting in a slides-based format. Why am I doing that? Well, a couple different reasons, but the primary one is that in my previous career, I was a professor, so I'm very used to presenting information using the slides as sort of a guiding post for my discussions or my lectures. So if this is not your typical format of how you absorb YouTube videos or things like that, this is just how I record things. So just sort of setting the stage for that. The second thing is that the goal of this video is to talk broadly about asymmetry in role-playing games, but I am going to be focusing on my games. In particular, I have an existing game and an upcoming game that really highlight this idea of asymmetry. So understand that this is not a broad video that is going to cover asymmetry across the entire TTRPG space, but more so what I think it is, why I think it's interesting and important, how I've implemented it, and then sort of offering the dialogue or conversation afterwards of what are some examples for you. So let's take it from there. What exactly is asymmetry? So outside of role-playing games, what does it mean for something to be asymmetrical? Well, it's not symmetrical. That's asymmetry. That's not a particularly helpful start unless we know what symmetrical means. So I guess if you understand what symmetry is and you then understand, well, it's not that, that's a start. But I don't love that. We can also think about it in terms of just generally speaking, there's sort of unequal parts or aspects of two things that are being compared, or a single entity that has unequal parts or aspects. A really obvious example would be something like asymmetry in our bodies, right? We typically see things like symmetry or asymmetry in the face, right? So if you're to kind of slice somebody's face down in the half, does it look the same on one side versus the other? There's a whole host of reasons where we might see slight differences or variations, and that would be asymmetry in the face or in the body or other things. But it doesn't have to be a physical thing. Asymmetry can also be sort of a relationship between two things. So an asymmetrical relationship would be one in which you have an unequal sort of standing or even power dynamic between you and another individual. That would be asymmetrical. That's a helpful start, but it has nothing really so far to do with TTRPGs. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the rules of play that we're going to use in our game are different, or to use the example from the left side, unequal between the players. So the players are going to be sitting down, they're going to be playing the same game, but the rules by which they engage with that game are going to be different from one another. And I mean, pretty different, not just small variations and little tweaks. I mean big differences between these players. What do I not mean when I say asymmetry? I don't mean that there's a difference in rules between how the GM plays the game, or the game master, or the dungeon master, or whatever name you want to call it, and the players in the game. Whenever I talk about asymmetry in games and I say D&D isn't asymmetrical, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit, people oftentimes will go, well, sure it is. The GM is doing different things than the players. That's not what I mean. Obviously, in a lot of games, there's going to be some sort of power dynamic difference, but also rules difference between the person who's in charge of sort of the logistics and running of the game and the people playing the game. So yes, let's acknowledge the fact that the GM and the players oftentimes have different rule sets or toolkits that they're using. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is going to be with the players themselves, the PCs, the adventurers, whatever word we want to call them. Are they playing by different rules? That's what we're going to focus on. I want to talk about a major inspiration for this to start. Asymmetry is not a new thing in games, and we have seen it appear in a whole host of different games across card games, video games, and board games for a very long time. My favorite example to talk about is the board game Root. It is one of my favorite games by Leader Games, and it's just fantastic. If you're not familiar with the game, the basic premise is that there's a big map of a forest and there's all these different clearings, And as the game title says right there, it's a game of woodland might and right. It's a competition. It's you can call it an area control game, a dudes on a map game, whatever you want to call it. There are 4 different factions that are vying for control of this forest. But the thing is, the game isn't won by being the faction that has held all the clearings by the end or anything like that. The game is won by getting victory points. The fun thing about Root is each faction earns victory points in wildly different ways. For example, if you are into like Euro-style board games, so those engine building games, you want to play as the cat in the bottom left because that truly is like an engine builder. Your board in front of you is about building up resources, allocating those resources, spending them to build more things and more things. And once you get that engine running, ooh, it feels really, really good. While the birds, the Erie, on the top right there, they are really kind of playing the game like a dudes on a map game. They have an army, essentially, and you're moving that army around, and it's sort of planning out the most logical way of deploying that army across this place. If both of those sound overwhelming, great news. You can just play as that raccoon right there. The raccoon is literally a single figure on the map, and they're running in and out of clearings into the forest, collecting junk, trading things, and things like that. They're doing something so different from one another, right? We've got engine building and sort of the buildings of empire. We've got armies moving around and like attacking people, and we've got a rascally raccoon. In the upper left is the kind of guerrilla warfare faction, and I still don't really understand how they work. I played Root for a really long time. I just don't play as them because it's just my brain cannot wrap myself around the rules. And I want you to hold on to that idea. My brain can't understand those rules, and yet I still play this game. That's going to be really, really important in a little bit. So this is just one example, but it's an example in which 4 people can sit down and play the game, but they're all playing different games. They're all getting victory points in very different ways, but they're interacting with the same map in some really cool, unique ways. So Root was a really, really big inspiration for me when I sort of thought about asymmetry in the sort of analog space, so outside of video games and things like that. So let's look at role-playing games or fantasy and stuff like that. I've got a picture of a wizard and a rogue here on the screen. When we think about the world's most popular role-playing game, aka D&D, and again, I hear people say D&D is asymmetrical. The wizard does different things than the rogue. I would argue that they don't. I would argue that they are largely doing the exact same thing. In D&D, the primary core mechanic that runs the game is you're going to roll a d20 and you're going to add a modifier, and that's going to be how you do things. There are always some small, differences in that, or slight variations in that song, so to speak. Maybe, for example, the enemy makes a save roll if you're doing like cleric spells. But what does that save roll look like? It's roll a d20 and add a modifier, right? So everybody's doing the same thing, which feels to me very strange. Because, while I have 2 artistically very different pictures here, let's just think about what a concept of a wizard versus a rogue is, and think about what would mechanics look like to sort of fit that vibe. A wizard is like tapping into the arcane magics of the world around them. They're literally bending reality, and how they cast that magic is, of course, dependent on the fiction of the game you're playing. But they're reality benders, right? They're doing magic. And a rogue is just a really sneaky person, right? They're running around hiding. They're getting like backstabs and cutting throats, and they should hit really hard when they hit. But it's all about sort of positioning and things like that. That's cool. Like, the premises of those 2 characters are very different from one another. But again, remember, at the end of the day, they're both, when they try and take down an enemy in D&D, they're going to roll a d20 and add a modifier most of the time. So there's not really an asymmetry between the way that they're playing. Yes, there's asymmetry in that the wizard is picking spells for their spell slots, and the rogue is going to get different variations with their subclasses. But the core mechanic by which they play the game is the same. I want you to be holding that into your head. So I want to break that apart, right? I want them to play differently. I want them to live in different spaces. How would we make that work though, right? You know, there's an easiness to having your classes and your roles and all of that sort of stuff in your game have the same rule, because now you all just sort of know universally what works and what doesn't work, or what you need to do and what you don't do. And what you need to do is roll a d20 and add a modifier, and you're going to compare it against some number. That's nice. You know, it's a rule that you can kind of hold in your head and know this applies to pretty much every situation that I'm in. There's an ease to that. So why would we not do that? And how exactly would it work? Well, in order for this to work, in order for people to sit down and have a wizard and a rogue play with different rules, a different sort of kind of core mechanic or a different thing that they're doing, you do still need a unifying goal or rule or objective in order for that to happen, right? So in Root, it's victory points. While each faction is doing completely different things, they are still all trying to do the same thing, which is earn victory points. It's just how they earn those victory points, very different from one another. So we need something in our fantasy role-playing game that is going to be a unifying rule that works, but how the players approach that rule can be very, very different. The way that works in Slayers and Dragon Slayers, the two games of mine that I'm going to be sort of focusing on from here on out, is the rule of 4+, which is very straightforward. It just means anytime you roll a die, regardless of the size of it or how many of them you're rolling, a 4 or above is a success, or called a hit. That's it. That's all you need, right? So if I'm rolling a d4, I've got a 25% chance of getting a hit. If I'm rolling a d6, I've got a 50-50 chance. d8 better, d10 even better, d12 even better, right? So we now have a unifying rule. Players are going to be rolling dice in this game, but how many dice they're rolling, what size dice they're rolling, why they're rolling, what they're doing with those rolls, all can be really, really different. As long as everybody just knows, hey, a 4 and above is good. It just means something has happened. The thing that you are trying to accomplish is being accomplished. That's it. That's all we really needed to do in order to make an asymmetrical experience work in the game. I'm going to put two examples of this from my upcoming game, Dragon Slayers, on the screen. Don't worry about reading the whole thing unless you really want to, but I just want to give you a sense about how this might play out between a rogue and a wizard in my game, in my fantasy game. So I mentioned earlier that rogues are those sneaky types, right? They're all about getting that like really big hit, that backstab that just takes out an opponent, or that they cut the throat, take them down. It's about positioning, it's about timing, it's finding that right window. So how do you make that work for our rogue in this game? Well, remember, 4+ is our success. So how are they going to do this? What are they going to be rolling? Well, they're going to have a die. It's called a dagger die. Understand that the whole rule set for this class is not on this screen. This is just one action that they can take. But they have a die, and that die is going to change in size. So we already know how that changing die size affects things like the odds of success. And on a hit, meaning 4+, they get to deal harm to their enemy, the monster that they're trying to fight. And that harm that they're dealing is based off of the speed difference. Speed is just how we would measure something like initiative, right? So in D&D, you have initiative scores that determine a turn order. Same thing with Dragon Slayers. But now the numerical difference between the rogue and their target matters. And they're really the only class where that matters. Sure, all the other classes care about speed scores because it determines their turn order. But the actual difference between those things doesn't matter. In like quantitative terms, we might call that an ordinal scale, where the order of things matters, but the numerical difference between the things doesn't actually matter. The rogue doesn't treat the turn order as ordinal. It matters to them. It's an interval scale. It's actually, it's an interval scale because a ratio would imply 0, and there's no 0 in Dragon Slayers. So it's an interval scale. The difference actually matters. And that's the whole game that they're playing now. Their game is all about how do I find targets that are slower than me, or how do I slow them down or speed myself up so that I can get those one-hit kills. That's something that the rogue uniquely can do, and nobody else can do it. What about the wizard? Oof, that's a really big wall of text. Don't worry about reading all of it. The wizard is almost like an elementalist in my game. They have 3 different dice, 3 different colored die, red, blue, and green die. And they're going to pick 2 of those colors, any 2 colors that they want, and they're going to roll them. And they're going to look and see which colors hit. And then using those, they're going to mix and match them, or lean all in on one of them, to cast one of 6 spells. And then that's how they cast their spells. So rather than like a wizard in D&D where you call your shot, you pick your spell, you burn your spell slot, and then you roll the d20 and modifier, you actually choose the spell after the fact in Dragon Slayers. You're going to pick the dice that are going to hopefully line up with the spell that you want to cast. But it's really, do the elements come together to help you? And remember, the rule of 4+ just means we're just looking for 4 pluses on any of those dice that show up. The wizard throughout the fight is going to be moving those dice up and down to increase or decrease the odds that certain colors hit and others don't hit as much, allowing them to sort of shift the sort of probabilities throughout the fight to land the spells that they want. So look at that. That's 2 classes that are playing the same game. They're both looking for 4 pluses. That's all that they needed. But they're doing really, really different things. I feel like this is a relatively good example to show how classes can sit down and play the game and play. They have that unifying goal, but the way that they approach that unifying goal is very different from one another. You might be asking yourself, why would you do this, right? Well, I guess first of all, why would we do this? Let's talk about it from like a cognitive or complexity perspective. Let's go back to Root. Root is one of my favorite games. I love Root. It is not necessarily the easiest game for me to convince other people to play. Why? Because it's a relatively complex game. There's if we were to look at sort of the weight of the game, it's a relatively heavy game. But it's not universally complex, right? There are some games that you sit down and everybody at the table has to agree to play a game that is that complex, or you have to play an entirely different game. Root kind of gets around that, right? Because you can sit down with somebody who wants a really finicky, like complicated thing, and they choose like the Woodland Alliance, or they choose the cat, and now they've got this like game, this little complex engine that they're building. And then you might be the person who goes, I don't want to deal with all of that. I just want to be the one raccoon running around. That's way easier for me to think about. By doing this, we invite tables to play our role-playing games with people who have different preferences of complexity, right? You can have some classes in your game that are much more fiddly, right? They're chewier experiences. They got a lot of things going on. The wizard, like I showed you earlier, would probably be a little bit more complex because you're trying to weave these spells after the fact and consider your probabilities ahead of time, and then what are your options afterwards. The rogue is relatively straightforward. Is my speed faster than them? Cool, I murder them. It's very, very quick, very effective way of playing the game without a lot of calculations, or certainly far fewer calculations or thought that has to go into it compared to the wizard. There's another class that I haven't even shown you, the cleric. They're not even rolling dice in Dragon Slayers when it comes to combat. So if you really want to be sort of a sit back and more of a supportive, guaranteed, straightforward role, the cleric is perfect for you. So we have now allowed people who have different preferences of complexity in their games, or different desires of cognitive load to take on, to sit down and play the same game as one another. I think that's incredibly valuable. The other big reason is it's fun, right? It's really fun to do this. It's fun to sit down and play Root and watch the other people try to figure out how to win the game with their rule set. I have played Slayers and Dragon Slayers for years now, and it's fun to sit down and watch players go, oh, wow, you get to do that? That's a thing that you do? That's weird and cool and different. Look at the thing that I do. That's a cool, exciting moment for the table, for somebody to sit down and get to really shine as their character class, right? Now you get to really sort of embody what that class is all about and show it off with mechanics that support it, as opposed to using a sort of safe, consistent rule set throughout the whole thing that then sort of just dilutes everybody's sort of identity of their class through play. The one other thing to consider, though, in this whole why thing is balance, right? How do you balance a game like this? That's a little bit more complicated and something that I won't do a full deep dive on. I'll say this. First of all, I'm not a big proponent of balance in role-playing games in the first place. My biggest argument for this is that nobody would ever fight in a fair fight in the real world. Why would they do it in a role-playing game? Now, you might go, yeah, that might be true, Spencer, but what about the fun aspect of it? I do genuinely think you can still have a lot of fun without having to worry about balance in your encounters or across players. This does mean that inherently some of the classes in the game are going to just be stronger than others. And when I mean stronger, I mean they're just going to deal a lot more damage than the others. But that's kind of already true in other role-playing games, right? There's sort of an inherent imbalance between the classes, and that really changes a lot, like across levels, right? Like in D&D, wizards are really squishy, and they're not really that great, to be honest, but then like high level wizards are unbelievably powerful compared to higher level versions of other classes. So there are already imbalances in other games, so I wouldn't really worry about it too much here. And again, I point back to the first bullet point when we talk about balance. I actually think it's kind of nice to have an imbalance between the classes because it is a more inviting opportunity for different people to be playing the game. I'll also just say that I know this works. I'm not just sort of making this up. This does, in fact, work. Slayers was created years ago, and since then there have been dozens of Slayers classes that have been created because people recognize, oh, I've got a fun little unique way to roll dice in my head. I bet I could design a Slayers class around it. So there's lots of people who have made things for this, but even still, just because people make something doesn't inherently mean that it works. So I will just kind of pat myself on the back here for a moment. Slayers was nominated for Best Rules, Product of the Year, Game of the Year for the Ennies when it was released. It won the award for Best Rules from the Indie Groundbreaker Award. So this is a rule system that is tried and true and recognized. So I hope that sort of gives me a little bit of credibility when I'm talking about why I think this is not just an interesting way of designing games, but a completely viable way of designing games. So I invite you to see for yourself. If you're not familiar with my games, Slayers would be one way that you could try it. That's a game that is already out, at least as the time of recording this. It's a game of monster hunters in a cursed city, and I have an upcoming game that I've alluded to throughout this video called Dragon Slayers, which is just a high fantasy version of that same thing. So it uses the same rule system that Slayers does with some changes. There's a free quick start available and a Kickstarter coming up. Links to all of these things will be down in the description below. But you are free to check this out yourself just to see if this is maybe something that vibes with you. So I just want to end this by just asking, what are your favorite examples? Are there games that you can think of where there are like true asymmetry between the players? Because I'd always love to learn about more people doing this or other examples of this happening. So hopefully you found this interesting. I had a lot of fun talking to you about it, and I hope to talk to you more. All right, I'll talk to you later. Bye.